Australia has endured a massive invasion by more than 2 billion cane toads. From just a few dozen individuals introduced in 1935, they have exploded in number and spread across the northern part of the continent, becoming one of the most notorious biological disasters in the world. Cane toads eat almost anything they can swallow, causing more than $100 million in agricultural damage in Australia every year. But what makes them even more frightening is the chemical weapon on their bodies. A toxin powerful enough to bring down a 200-kilogram crocodile after a single mistaken bite. For decades, it seemed that Australia had accidentally created a creature that was almost impossible to stop. But then, along tropical ponds, scientists discovered something completely unexpected. The most dangerous enemy of these toads turned out to be nothing more than a colony of tiny ants. So what is really happening in this brutal battle? Let's explore it together on Mandarin Tech. Let's go back to Australia in the 1930s. At that time, the sugar industry was one of the most important pillars of the country's agriculture, especially in the state of Queensland. About 400,000 hectares of land were covered with endless sugarcane fields. Each year, Australia produced more than 6 million tons of sugarcane, generating large amounts of sugar for both domestic use and export, bringing in over $200 million in revenue, a huge number for the agricultural economy of that era. But at the same time, a tiny enemy was quietly destroying this entire system, the cane beetle. These insects laid their eggs in the soil. Their larvae fed on plant roots, while the adults chewed through the stems and leaves. When their population exploded, tens of thousands could appear in a single hectare, sharply reducing crop yields and causing about $30 million in losses every year for sugarcane farmers. Today, problems like this are usually handled with pesticides. But in the early 20th century, modern agricultural chemicals barely existed, and the available pest control methods were expensive and ineffective. So scientists turned to a solution that was becoming popular at the time: biological control. The idea was simple. If a natural predator could eat the cane beetles, it could become a living bodyguard for the sugar fields. Their choice was the cane toad, an amphibian from Central and South America. On paper, the plan sounded reasonable, but in reality, it had a serious flaw. Adult cane beetles spend most of their time on the stalks and tops of the plants, while cane toads mostly stay on the ground. This meant Australia's biological weapon could never reach its main target. And when a predator cannot catch the prey humans expect it to hunt, it does what every predator does. It eats anything it can swallow. However, releasing cane toads to control cane beetles was not a crazy idea at the time. In fact, these amphibians naturally live in Central and South America, where they have coexisted with native predators for millions of years. In those ecosystems, many animals have evolved to recognize or avoid their toxins. So cane toads are simply a normal part of the food chain, rather than an ecological disaster. But when they were introduced to Australia in 1935, everything was completely different. Cane toads are far from harmless amphibians. They are large, tough, omnivorous, reproduce quickly, and most importantly, they carry an extremely powerful chemical defense system. Behind their heads are two large poison glands that release bufotoxin, a toxic mixture that can strongly affect the heart, nervous system, and respiratory system. For predators that had evolved alongside them in the Americas, this was nothing unusual. But for Australia's ecosystem, it became a dangerous biological trap. A snake sees a slow-moving prey. A monitor lizard sees an easy meal. A marsupial predator simply does what it has done for millions of years. But this time, the prey is a toxin-filled machine. Many native predators that attacked cane toads were quickly poisoned. Ironically, these were the very species that once helped maintain ecological balance. In many areas, the northern quail population declined sharply, and several monitor lizard populations also dropped rapidly after cane toads arrived. What made the situation even worse is that the toxin is not limited to adult toads. Their eggs are toxic, their tadpoles are toxic, even the young toads are toxic. If cane toads only had powerful toxins, they might not have become such a serious ecological disaster. What truly makes this species frightening is its extremely high reproductive rate and its almost uncontrolled ability to spread. A single adult female can lay 20,000 to 30,000 eggs in one breeding event, and under favorable conditions, many of those eggs can survive. When water is abundant after the rainy season, temperatures remain warm, and predator pressure is low. Cane toad populations can grow very rapidly within just a few breeding cycles, but they do not only multiply in one place, they also continue expanding their territory. Over the past decades, cane toads have spread across northern Australia, gradually moving into new ecosystems. At first, their spread was relatively slow because their numbers were still small and conditions were not yet ideal. However, once the population reached a large enough size, the invasion front began to accelerate. In many regions, the boundary of their distribution can advance by 40 to 60 kilometers each year, forming a massive biological wave slowly sweeping across the ecosystems of the continent. But even an almost perfect invasive machine has moments of weakness. For cane toads, that brief window appears right after they complete metamorphosis. When the tadpoles leave the water and become tiny young toads, their bodies are still very fragile. Their reflexes are not fully developed, their jumping ability is weak, and their movement is slow. Because they lose water easily, they are forced to gather in narrow strips of moist ground along the edges of ponds and streams. This accidentally creates a very unusual scene. Hundreds of young toads appearing at the same time in an extremely small area. And in many parts of northern Australia, that is exactly the territory of meat ants. Scientists began to observe something remarkable. As the young toads crawl out of the water, ant colonies quickly detect them. Unlike snakes or birds, ants do not attack with a single strike. They operate in a completely different way, through numbers. Dozens of ants latch onto the toad's legs, back, head, and eyes at the same time. They hold the young toad in place, constantly biting and pulling. For such a tiny animal, this overwhelming attack is almost impossible to resist. The cane toad's defense strategy, staying still so predators get poisoned, almost doesn't work in this situation. Ants do not need to swallow their prey like vertebrates do. They only need to hold it long enough for the entire colony to feed on it. The attacks by ants along pond edges revealed something surprising to ecologists. Cane toads are not invincible. Their powerful defenses only work against the wrong kind of predator. The most dangerous weapon of the cane toad is the pair of poison glands behind its head. When vertebrate predators such as snakes, monitor lizards, marsupials, or even crocodiles bite the toad, toxins quickly enter their bodies. Within a short time, the poison can disrupt the nervous system and heart, causing many predators to collapse before they even realize what happened. But this defense system is almost useless against insects. Unlike vertebrates, insects have a completely different biological structure. Their nervous system and circulation work in ways that are very different from animals with hearts and blood vessels like ours. Because of this, many toxins that strongly affect the heart have little impact on insects. This creates a strange biological paradox. A poison strong enough to kill predators weighing hundreds of kilograms can sometimes fail to stop a swarm of tiny ants. The difference becomes especially dangerous during the toad's early life stage. Newly transformed toadlets that leave the water are slow, weak jumpers, and often gather along damp ground near the edges of ponds. When dozens of ants swarm over their legs, backs, and eyes, the toad's chemical defenses become almost useless. Scientists call this phenomenon an evolutionary trap, when a strategy that once worked in one environment becomes a weakness in another. However, ants are not a perfect solution. In places with fewer ant colonies or more hiding spots, many young toads still manage to survive. It shows that ants are only the first layer of nature's response to this invasive species. In 2018, scientists in Australia began testing a completely new strategy to control cane toads, stopping them at the tadpole stage before they can move onto land and become part of the expanding invasion. Instead of trying to eliminate adult toads, which can travel widely and carry dangerous toxins, researchers decided to focus on the earliest stage of their life cycle, when they are still concentrated in water and much easier to manage. To do this, they developed a special biological bait pellet made from toxins extracted from adult cane toads. In nature, cane-toed tadpoles respond strongly to chemical signals released by their own species. These signals are often related to food, competition, or other biological processes within the species. Scientists use this natural behavior to create a unique chemical scent capable of attracting tadpoles from a considerable distance. When the pellet is placed inside a small underwater trap, usually set in ponds, wetlands, or irrigation channels, the tadpoles follow the chemical signal and swim into the trap. The structure of the trap is quite simple but highly effective. Tadpoles can easily swim in following the water flow and scent, but they almost never find their way back out. Field tests have shown impressive results. Within just a few hours, hundreds or even thousands of tadpoles can gather inside a single small trap. They are then collected and removed, usually humanely euthanized through rapid freezing. This method helps stop large numbers of cane toads before they ever leave the water and join the next wave of the invasion. But humans are not the only force controlling cane toads. The battle actually begins underwater. In ponds and wetlands, many invertebrate predators eat cane toad eggs, tadpoles, and hatchlings. Dragonfly larvae, predatory water beetles, and fishing spiders all play a role. Once on land, the stories of adaptation become even more remarkable. The racali, Australia's native water rat, has developed a very precise hunting strategy. Instead of biting randomly, it flips the toad over, cuts open the belly, and eats only the heart and liver, carefully avoiding the poison glands behind the head where most of the toxin is concentrated. Some birds have also learned how to handle this unusual prey. Crows and magpies often target the less dangerous parts of the toad's body, while some scavenging birds focus only on soft tissues. Perhaps the most impressive example is the Australian ibis. Often jokingly called the bin chicken, this bird has shown remarkable adaptability. It picks up the toad, shakes it to remove some of the toxin, then dips the prey into water before eating, almost as if it is preparing the meal first. Among reptiles, adaptation is happening in different ways as well. Some snake species have learned to avoid cane toads entirely. Certain populations of red-bellied black snakes appear to have developed better toxin tolerance, and they also tend to have smaller heads, making it harder for them to swallow large toads, the individuals that contain the most poison. Even crocodiles show interesting responses. Freshwater crocodiles have been observed eating only the hind legs of cane toads, while saltwater crocodiles, with their enormous body size, seem large enough to swallow the prey whole without being seriously affected by the toxin. Australia is no longer completely helpless against cane toads as it once was in the early decades. In areas where this invasive species has been present for a long time, growing evidence shows that the ecosystem is gradually adapting. Some predators have learned to avoid cane toads entirely. Others have discovered safer ways to eat them by skipping the toxic parts. And many species simply shift their focus to eggs, tadpoles, or young toads, the most vulnerable stages in the life cycle. But the overall picture is still far from reassuring. The cane toad invasion front continues to expand westward and southward across Australia. And whenever they enter a new ecosystem, the old scenario risks repeating itself. Local wildlife there has never encountered cane toads before. They have no experience, no avoidance instincts, and have not yet gone through enough natural selection to adapt. This makes the battle uneven across space. In regions where cane toads have lived for decades, nature is beginning to find ways to fight back. But at the edges of the invasion, ecosystems are still facing the initial shock. Meanwhile, humans are also experimenting with smarter intervention strategies. The story of cane toads in Australia is not just a local ecological problem. It has become one of the world's most famous examples of the consequences of poorly understood biological intervention. During the 20th century, many countries believed that introducing a new species to control pests was a simple and effective solution. But reality has shown that ecosystems are far more complex than humans once imagined. Australia is not the only place to face this problem. Around the world, invasive species have caused similar ecological disruptions. Rabbits in Australia, Asian carp in North America, and brown tree snakes on Guam all demonstrate how a single introduced species can reshape entire ecosystems. Once they spread widely, removing them becomes extremely difficult, sometimes nearly impossible. Because of this, the cane toad case has become an important lesson in modern biological management. Today, before any species is introduced into a new environment, scientists must carefully study the potential ecological impacts. In nature, even a small decision can create consequences that last for centuries. Once introduced as a biological weapon to save sugarcane fields, the cane toad eventually became one of the most expensive ecological lessons in the world. But over time, Australia's ecosystem has begun to fight back. Not with a perfect solution, but through many small adaptations, from ants and aquatic insects to birds, snakes, and crocodiles. What has changed is not only nature, but also the way humans understand it. Because in complex ecosystems, victory rarely comes from a single simple solution, but from the ability to learn and adapt. Like and follow Mandarin Tech so you don't miss the next incredible stories about science and technology.